Anyway, thank you all for coming. And one more time, being a good huckster, if you would please consider joining our society. We'd love to have you. We do lots of really interesting things, including iris group orders, for example, where you can get very different kinds of irises for your garden, which you may not have ever seen before, but which are now becoming very available. So we all know about climate change, and I'm going to talk to you about climate change and where irises fit in that picture and why irises are wonderful garden plants to grow in your garden as you adapt your gardens for climate change, which is going to happen very quickly. So in my presentation, I'm going to talk to you about, first of all, climate change and what's happening, just to set your clocks and perspectives on why we need to adapt. I'm then going to address the issues of climate change adaptation in your garden. So what you can do in your garden, and not everything because it's a very large topic, but some key things. And then I'm going to show pictures and talk about specific irises or groups of irises that are excellent to be growing in your gardens as an adaptation to climate change. And I'll throw a couple in that are probably not such good choices in the future unless you're prepared to water. This talk is a lot about water. If you remember this, you won't have as much water as you need for your garden as you have now, so you're going to have to make adaptations for less water. And the final message is irises are perfect adaptation plants for climates with less water. You can leave now. And the choice is enormous. All colors, many different kinds of forms. So let's go for it now. Iris, we call it the flower for all seasons. If you read our bulletin and go to our websites, I'd like to recast that and call it the flower for dry seasons. And that's what we're going to be facing. So that's the entire lecture in a nutshell. And there's a beautiful picture of tall-bearded iris, B original. Now, all the irises that I'm going to show you do not get water in our garden. They are not watered. My garden is adapted for no watering, except to get some of them started. And once they're started, no summer water. Topics, as I mentioned, climate change and its impacts, garden adaptations, and iris choices. Here's a beautiful Siberian iris, strawberry fair. Temperatures are going up, but not only are temperatures going up, and you can see them here rising very rapidly. They've risen by about 1 degree in the past few decades. They will likely rise significantly more than that. But as the temperatures rise, there's more energy in the atmosphere. That drives all atmospheric processes such as storms, the jet stream, winds, rain, everything you can imagine all around the globe. The atmosphere is like this great warming carpet or sock around the globe, and things are moving around in it all the time. So temperatures are rising, but it's more than temperatures just rising. Weather is changing because the climate is changing. Why? Because of increased greenhouse gases. This is a graph showing how much greenhouse grasses, not glasses, have increased from about 1970 or so. That's just since 1970. But the increase goes way back to 150, 200 years ago when we were at 280 parts per million. This is simply the increase in the amount of greenhouse gases, not the amount. But it's steadily going up. And just to give you a sense of how temperatures are changing globally, this is a picture of May 2018. Every dark red spot on there is a record temperature globally. And if you look at these pictures of the globe, going back, March 2016 was a very, very warm year because there was a strong El Nino. At that time, you would see dark red all over the map. So it's not just warmer, which is pink or light pink. It is actually way warmer, so much warmer that we're constantly setting record temperatures from year to year. The last 4 or 5 years have been the warmest for ever. 1998 was a warm year, but the last few years very warm. Despite our cold February, which is a consequence of the changing climate, because there's an issue with the jet stream. It doesn't know what it wants to do anymore, and so we are having problems with cold and warm air not mixing in the way that they normally do. So, how much is it rising? What's the challenge that we face, basically? And there's no end in sight, by the way, because we're still adding carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, and the carbon dioxide that is in the atmosphere stays there for a very long time until it goes into the ocean or into a plant. So it keeps warming the atmosphere for centuries to come. Centuries to come. So carbon dioxide exceeded 4.14 parts per million in 2019 for the first time in 800,000 or more years. Began at 280 in pre-industrial times, so that's way back in our great-great-great-grandfathers' times. It has reached 412 last week average in March. You can go to Mauna Loa CO2, just go to the website Mauna Loa CO2, and you can see what it is every single day. And by the time April and May roll around, we will be setting new records. So end of the year, or end of the spring, beginning of the spring is when we set new records. I won't explain why, but it has to do with plants. 35% of it is in the last 14 years. So it's not sort of this gradual thing that's going up. Much of it has happened in the last 14 years. We put an exhibit in at the museum 14 years ago. That's how I know. I've looked at the comparison between today and then, and it's gone up huge amount, 35% of the increase. And if we take a look at 2016, it was an exceptional year, an El Nino year, which is normal for future conditions. In other words, this extra warm year of 2016 is actually foreseeing the future. If you look in British Columbia, most of the province with either much above normal or record warm temperatures. So that is going to be the normal condition, but it's going to get warmer still than that. So the next El Nino year that we get, a strong El Nino, this will happen again. It'll all be red or orange. One of the more interesting things that happens is that the average temperature is shifting, and people say, well, I'm the frog in the water and the water's warming and I don't know that I'm boiling because it's only moving just a tiny bit. But what actually happens is because there's more energy in the atmosphere, that energy has to go somewhere. It goes into the atmosphere in a way that the weather systems and the warm and cool places are getting deformed or mixed around in a way that they weren't before, so we get much more in the way of extremes. So if we take a look at how frequently extreme conditions occurred, 1950 to 1980, that would be once in a very, very long, very, very infrequently, 0.1% of the time, they never happened. By 2011 to 2013, and this is even worse now, for summer temperatures, those things that never happened, or happened so frequently they might as well never happen, are now happening 14% of the time. In other words, extreme hot temperatures, which almost never happened 30 years ago, 40 years ago, are now happening 14% of the time. And the years since 2013 have been very warm, so this number here is probably more like 15, 18, 20% of the time. We are in a different world, and we're moving rapidly into yet a more different world. So the climate and the weather are changing, including not just the average temperature, but extreme events like rainfall, like weird frost months, as in February, or very hot and dry summers. Other things that are happening, and this influences our weather and our climate, are the disappearance of the Arctic ice, sea ice. So here is what the typical thing was in 1979. You know, I forget which month this is for, September, which is the low point. This much of the Arctic Ocean was covered by sea ice, and the purpler it is, that's old ice. It's many, many years old ice, thick ice. This little light colored stuff is annual ice, young ice. If we go to 2011, huge decrease in area covered. The north part of Siberia is now ice-free. It's ice-free every year now. There's no problem in the Northwest Passage, and you can go around Siberia if you want to go there, which you could not do in the past, because as you can see here, ice went all the way to the land. And you'll see there's this mass of old ice, but there's a lot more young ice as well. And so these small amounts of ice these amounts of ice are continuing to decline, and there's less and less ice in the north. This year will be a good year to watch to see how little ice we have. Our glaciers on the coast are also melting, so the amount of water that goes into the rivers and streams is declining. The amount of snow cover is declining. And as I said, there are these extreme events. But the one thing about having more energy in the atmosphere, because it's trapped by the greenhouse gases, there also means that there's more moisture in the atmosphere, because the warmer the atmosphere, the more water it can hold. But eventually, somewhere, as that moisture that's evaporated at the equator works its way northward, it has to come out of the sky in clouds, in huge, intense rainfall events. So we get bigger, heavier rainfall events that sit in a place much longer. So this is in Europe in the year 2013. When we went as a young family to Austria a few years ago, we also saw a big flooding of the Danube. So it can't get rid of the water that falls onto the ground fast enough, so it builds up on the landscape and it floods places that have never been flooded before. So floods are also a consequence of climate change. Droughts. We know about droughts here on the east side of Vancouver Island and the Gulf Islands, and also in the interior of British Columbia. Here's just an example of the U.S. Drought Monitor 2014. California, very, very dry. Well, it got drier still, and all of California was in extreme drought until a couple of years ago, where all of a sudden it started to rain and we have floods. Drought will be the normal conditions, but it will be punctuated, as they say, by flooding. And there are consequences. We who are familiar with our iconic native species, the western red cedar, see them dying. You cannot drive up the east side of Vancouver Island without seeing all the dead cedars or dying red cedars that are there. This is a consequence of summer drought. Not enough moisture. Could be lots of moisture in the winter, but not enough in the summer months. The trees have nothing to drink. They essentially die slowly of thirst. And here on the Sunshine Coast, it's not just western red cedars that are dying here, but even the lodgepole pines, which are pretty drought tolerant on shallow, mossy soils over bedrock, also have died. And now Douglas firs are also beginning to perish because of the intensity of the summer drought. That's telling you what the conditions are in your garden, in the future, and already, in fact. Some sobering thoughts about the challenge of this, not 100 years from now, but the challenge is in the next few decades, that when there was this amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere 2 to 5 million years ago, that's before the Ice Age, the temperatures in Ellesmere Island in the Canadian Arctic were 19 degrees Celsius warmer than they are today. Not 1 or 2, it's because all of the heat, that extra heat, gets shifted to the north, as far north as it'll go, and there were great forests growing on Ellesmere Island. That's for the same amount of carbon dioxide as we have today. Sea levels, for the same warmer temperature that we are almost at now, and certainly will be at in a few decades, we're eventually 5 to 7 centimeters higher. And unless we do something, and that, when I did this originally, it said pre-2020, well, 2020 is less than a year from now, we're committed to at least 1.5 degrees. One of the challenges in the garden and in our landscapes and in our society is that these changes that are happening respond slowly to the rate at which carbon dioxide is increasing in the atmosphere, because you could put the CO2 in the atmosphere, global systems do things, they put some of it in the ocean, in the land, etc. And then eventually the temperatures and the carbon dioxide concentrations catch up to each other. And you can see this over 400,000 years. Here is the temperature, here's the carbon dioxide. They're all very closely linked until now. We have way more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere than our temperatures tell us we have. In other words, the temperatures have to catch up here. if we follow this curve. So everything's holding back, waiting for something to happen. There's going to be a kind of a snapping and catching up at some time, not in the distant future. If we take a look at what that means in terms of our landscapes and what grows there, getting closer and closer to our gardens, this is a map that shows you where ecosystems are. We're brownish, yellowish, or greenish. This is the coastal rainforest. This is the coastal Douglas fir zone. Here's the Okanagan that Penny was telling us about, grasslands and dry forested ecosystems. In the future, by the year 2080, it's going to look like this in terms of the climates. Okanagan climates will be way up into here, and even some sort of halfway up the slope Okanagan climates will be up into northeastern British Columbia. Douglas fir and even grassland climates will be here around Vancouver Island. That is what we're looking at in terms of changes for your garden and for ecosystems in the next few decades. What are gardens but ecosystems? What are gardeners but ecosystem managers? You are all ecologists when you work in your garden. You're asking questions of plants by trying them in one place or another place. Do you meet the requirement of the plant or not? That is an ecological question. Even though all weeding and everything else, those are ecological interventions as far as the plant is concerned. You are ecosystem practitioners, every one of them. If the atmospheric and climatic and weather conditions change, you as an ecosystem manager is going to have to change the way you manage your garden. And you will have to grow different plants. And we've done a little bit of modeling of what that might look like for you in the future. You can see this at the Royal BC Museum in the galleries. Here is a distribution of climates and the plants that can grow there based on something called growing degree days. It means how many warm days do you have in the year before one frost and another frost. You'll see that in much of British Columbia, not much. Beautiful plants, rock garden plants that grow in the alpine, and then maybe you could grow some pasture, but not probably very good pasture. This is why there aren't a lot of farms up there. And then we get into my personal heritage of cabbage, potato, and cereals from Eastern Europe, right? That's why we are strong, because we eat a lot of cabbage. And then corn and tomatoes, those kinds of crops are here in the south. And grapes and plums and peaches, the bright green, as you can see here, only in the Okanagan Valley, a little bit in Kamloops, somewhere here. Idea of growing avocados and sugarcane, of course, is completely craziness. Except if we take a look at the future, remember it was blue and white. By the end of the century, at relatively extreme climate change, but this is the track we're on to now, it's green. The people in Fort St. John are growing a wonderful wine they call Chateau de Fort Saint Jean or Chateau de Prince George. It'll be a varietal red. This will probably be a white. And down in here you see pink, not pink, but orange and red. And what can we be growing in Vancouver, in southern Vancouver Island? Avocados and sugarcane as commercial crops, or perhaps, if we're conservative, cottons, lemons, and oranges. That is the future of your gardens. That is the future of the gardens in British Columbia. So if people say, well, I can't grow that because the climate's too cold or not suitable, wait a decade and get those irises going now in a nice warm spot, because they're going to be gangbusters plants for you within 20 years or so. So that is the scope of change that you're looking at in your gardens. And what can we do about this change? So just in the summary here, BC future, what can we expect? Warmer, wetter winters, hotter, drier, longer summers, extremes in temperatures and rainfall, winds, more fires, we've already got that happening, unpredictability and sudden changes. How do you construct a garden, beautiful vegetables and food under such a set of circumstances? Well, you get plants that can tolerate wide ranges of conditions. Irises, and I'm going to talk about that in a moment, but first, what can we expect in our gardens and what can we do in our gardens. Northward shift of hardiness zones. We all know about hardiness zones. Well, the ones that are further south are now going to be much further north. The changes will vary by region because each region has its own characteristic climate and sort of fits in the context of the atmospheric circulation in its own way. The changes will vary by site. Drier sites will be even drier, whereas less exposed sites on north sides of houses will be a little less responsive to it. Water will be an issue. Pests and diseases are moving, and of course, because there are extremes and air masses moving about on the landscape, you're going to get winds. Hardiness zones. So this is where we are now. And I couldn't find the map of where we will be, but knowing your hardiness zone, and this is the US Department of Agriculture hardiness zones. Canada has its own that are a little bit more sophisticated. You can just go to planthardiness.gc.ca and find out where you are, and I'm sure there's somewhere there where it tells you where you will be in the future. So we can grow irises up into central British Columbia easily. In the 2 decades or two, you can be growing them all over BC and there'll be no problem anywhere. So how do we adapt our garden? The first, I'm going to focus on a couple of things here, but just as a list, reduce your water consumption. Summer water is going to be an issue, full stop. You cannot be watering and sprinkling as we waste water in our gardens today. And grow drought-adapted plants. That's where iris is fixed. But there are other things I'm going to address as well. Use compost and mulch as much as you can. Retain carbon. In other words, don't get rid of the carbon, have it shipped off, burned, or otherwise. Put it back on or in the soil. Go organic, because organic, to the extent you can, you don't have to be purist about this unless you want to be, because it takes a lot of energy to create pesticides, herbicides, and especially fertilizers. And energy reduces carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Go patchy. Rather than having uniform large landscapes planted in the same sort of thing, you mix it like nature is. Nature is a mosaic. It has different plants growing in different situations. Naturalize, take advantage of the plants that already know how to grow in the landscapes where we are, and some of which have ranges that go much further south. For example, ocean spray. Everybody like ocean spray as a plant? Ocean spray grows in the mountains of Arizona, where the climate is a little cooler and has some winter, but nevertheless, that's how far south it grows. So there are many native plants that are well adapted to the kinds of futures that we might have. And then be aware of fire as an issue. An interesting thing about irises and fire. Okay, water. A, use less water. Simple rule. 2, grow moisture-efficient plants. Irises, here's a beautiful dwarf bearded iris, devoted photo by Ted. Beautifully suited to dry sites. Retain natural moisture and storage by using techniques such as rain gardens, for example, or mulch is another technique that can use. And understand where the moisture deficits are going to be on your property so that you know where it's going to be wet, or dry, you put your effort into trying to reduce the drought conditions in those parts of the garden. I'm going to talk about mapping your property in a minute. And then if you do need to water, be very efficient about how you do it. Use drip or soaker irrigation systems. Don't throw the water up into the air, of which most of it evaporates and disappears. This is the most efficient way to get rid of water into the atmosphere, is by spraying it into the water. Not a good way of watering. So here is one technique that people use, are rain gardens. Here is a rain garden where the rainfall, when it goes here onto the roof, this is in Portland, doesn't go into the drain and out to the ocean, but the rainfall is distributed through a pipe with a little hole like it here, spread over a wide area like this, infiltrates through this wall, rain wall garden, where you can plant all sorts of things on top and here, because it's going to get a little bit of moisture, it's a bit shaded, and then finds its way at the bottom into a swale at the base of the wall, where if you just excavate it a little bit, you have a moisture receiving site, natural moisture, and you can grow water-requiring plants. So that you simply use the rain that's available to you seasonally and concentrate its effects in places where you can grow moisture-requiring plants, such as Louisiana, Japanese, or Siberian irises. So here's a way: map your landscape, find where you can put the water, and create a situation, a swale, where the water will be retained. Use all the water you do get. Here's another example from Portland where the boulevards, or in this case a parking lot area between here and here, is not paved, but the water goes into the ground, it's retained in the ground, and for irises this is an ideal situation because there's adequate moisture through much of the year, and then it doesn't lose a huge amount of moisture during the summer because there's also moisture available under this paved area, and the only way out is through here. If it works its way up through the soil through there, of course, the roots pick it up and the plants grow. Now, mapping a property. This is our home, and 2 or 3 weeks ago, the snow has just gone, about a week ago. And there are many different habitats in here, particularly in terms of moisture and heat. So, aspect, right? We know this: right plant, right place, right iris. Aspect, which way does it face? South, warmer, drier. North, not so much. What is the slope? The more the slope is steep, the more energy is taken by that slope. The more is available by that slope because of the angle of the sun hitting it this way. Rather than hitting it from above and bouncing off, it goes in here, it can't bounce off in the same way, and it's absorbed here. Where is the shade for cooling? Because we're going to need to cool some areas for certain kinds of irises. You cannot grow bearded irises in Texas because it's too hot in the summertime unless you plant them in the shade, and then they're okay. A weird thing for them. Texture, whether there's gravel, sand, or whatever, how does the water go into it, and how does it drain away? And finally, think about what that would be in the future. South-facing slopes like this are going to be very, very warm, very, very dry. The more extreme, around the backside, it'll be moderated a little bit by the shade and the north aspect. So here's my very poor drawing. You're trying to use a computer. Cold and shady in the northeast, cool and shady in the north and the northwest, hot and sunny in the southwest. This is your much hottest aspect right here. And warm and sunny over here on the east. Very simple thing to do, but you map your property and very coarsely around every structure. Where's the energy? Where are the extremes going to be? Slopes and water, very important. Even gentle slopes. What you may not appreciate is a water table on a slope doesn't go straight like this and down like this. It actually goes along and is much deeper in the profile at the crest. Even a little raised bed like this, there's a huge difference between the local position of the water table at the corner of the raised bed than at the back. And of course, the water table comes here, so it's moist in here. And then in a swale, you could collect the water. So just a simple mapping of slopes and aspects shows you how complex your landscape is and where you can grow different plants with different adaptations. Texture. We know this in general terms, but I'm throwing in here this idea of organic matter. Gravel is dry, sand is dry, silt and loam is moist, and clay can be wet to moist. That's pretty good, unless this is baked by the sun, and if it's really hot, like it might be in the year 2080, this will turn to brick, and it'll be hard and dry, and you won't be able to grow anything in it. But add organic material, even gravel, well, it'll still be dry. But if you add it to sand, you move from dry to medium to moist conditions. In silty loam, which is what all of our gardens are trying to achieve, with organic you will maintain it being moist, but it won't be sopping wet because the texture with organics never becomes dense and low pores like clay. If you add organics to clay, instead of being wet to moist, it'll be moist and porous with lots of opportunities for roots to grow. So texture matters, and you want to map it. I want to speak briefly about organic matter. It matters. Organic matter matters And matter, organic matter and mulch are two related things. Here's a barrel full of wonderful bark mulch that I use very widely in the garden. Organic matter reduces moisture loss because it retains moisture in general in the soil, because it holds moisture. If it's on the surface, it doesn't evaporate as quickly. And under a good mat of this stuff, even in the hottest, driest part of the summer, it'll be moist underneath, immediately below the surface. It doesn't take much, maybe 5 centimeters at most, a little bit compacted. It will not dry out underneath. Improves moisture penetration. If you add organic matter into the soil, including the texture, when it does rain, instead of just falling on the surface and going back right up into the atmosphere, it goes into the ground where it's available for the roots. When it breaks down slowly. It's not like a drug fix of nitrogen fentanyl. It breaks down slowly and releases the food at the same rate that the plants actually can take it up. So it doesn't get washed out of the soil out somewhere. It isn't. It's always available until it's used up, or you add a little bit more organic matter. So there's more stability, more resilience of moisture in the soil. The nutrients from the breakdown of organic matter are the kinds that the plants know how to use efficiently and effectively. Yes, you can get, again, like your overdose of nitrogen or phosphorus or potassium in the best soluble form to be taken up, like Miracle Grow, which is not a bad substance, but you put it on there, it gets green right away. That's because you're essentially pumping it right into the circulatory system of the plant. But in naturally breaking down organic matter, much more take-upable, as they say. And finally, it improves the texture and porosity. So you can, with good organic matter, you don't even need a shovel. You can use your fingers to dig. That's the great soil that you want. Okay, here's an example of mulch, not of an organic matter kind, but of a little bit of gravel, of granitic gravel. And I think that is this plant that's sitting right there with that wonderful Iris reticulata eye catcher in it. So even stones will keep the moisture in. They don't break down and create the ideal soil that you want below them, but they work perfectly in terms of moisture management. And here is my garden bed a few years back, iris, bearded irises here. These paths between the raised beds are mulched with organic matter. All the water that's under here has only one way out in the summer when there's evaporation, and that's up through here, and then the roots of the irises or whatever else you're growing there snaggles the water and they grow. I do not water these beds at all. With this mulching, with a little bit of organic matter in here, I do not have to water irises at all. So let's move on. So irises for climate change. Why are irises a great choice for your climate change garden? Well, many of us who grow irises already know this in many ways. But first of all, irises occur across a very wide climatic range. So cold to pretty warm, wet to dry. They tolerate weather extremes. You can pour on them as long as it drains away, it's going to be fine. They tolerate, most important, drought. Not all of them, but most of them tolerate drought. They're not fussy about their soil, although, of course, like all of us, they like to be fed well here and respond positively. Although everybody complains about them, the maintenance, if you've got them going right when you begin with, the maintenance is very straightforward. There isn't a heck of a lot to do about it. They can grow in part shade to full sun, depending on the kind. So it gives you choices on your landscape of your garden. They are a great alternate to woody plants, like in boulevards, where you need to water the woody plants. You don't need to water them. You don't have to support the great woody infrastructure that grows above the ground. They're easy to increase and move. Bearded irises, although best at the end of the flowering season into the summer, you can move them at any time. So you have a huge amount of flexibility to use them. And the choice is huge if you look at all the range of irises, which we are going to do. Here's a wonderful pink iris called Happenstance, according to Ted, the best pink iris that you can grow. So, iris and dry seasons. This is the range of the distribution of irises across warm, mid to cool, mid latitudes, but a lot of them come from areas that have intense summer droughts, such as the Mediterranean, such as parts of California in here, so that they are well adapted for a dry season. And that's the key thing, that most irises are adapted for a dry season. Some have evolved for wetter conditions, but the iris family as a group originates where it's dry in the summers. Drought is us, if you want to summarize irises. And if we take a look at them here, I'll be speaking to each of these briefly with some pictures, but just take a look first of all at their hardiness. 4 is cold. 4 is like northern British Columbia. 3 is pretty cold, and 1 for Siberians is damn cold. But look at the range. They can grow right up to climates like that of Vancouver Island and warmer. And warmer in the Zone 10, this is the U.S. Department of Agriculture zones. All of them. Huge range of climatic conditions. Some don't take the frost so well. The Japanese Spurious Pacific coasts probably can tolerate a little bit more cold than this. Algerians, truly a Mediterranean one, but Dutch bulbous down to 5. Siberians bearded. I mean, you've got a huge temperature range. They can take winters. They can also take pretty warm summers. But if we take a look at the moisture conditions, pretty much all of them have dry as part of what they can handle. Bulbous, dry medium. Bearded, dry to medium. Siberians, medium, but they can take summer drought. Dutch bulbous, medium. Algerian, dry. Full sun. Arrowbred, dry. Pacific coast, you know, they can take dry conditions in the summer. And then when you get into their little prima donnas of the iris world, don't make it too dry for me, I don't like it, but I'll give you beautiful flowers, but treat me well. So there we see the scope of possibilities. I'm going to start though with heritage irises. The thing about heritage irises that are out on the landscape that have been there for a long time is they are tough. They survive on the rocks of Metchosin, on the moss. Maybe somebody planted them a long time ago. They've been there since before the Second World War. They're still there. They bloom wonderfully. They survive on Trial Island. They bloom there. What is it telling us? If you want to grow one iris, plant this and you don't have to do anything ever again. This iris, Lente Williamson, which by the way grows in very cold climates in Ontario and Michigan, is just super powerful. I can't get rid of it. Whenever I think I have a rhizome that I've been, you know, this has got to be a different one. No, it's because the nearby Lente Williamson spread, the one I paid a bunch of money for, died, and this one is still there. So this is the traditional classic iris. Think heritage irises that have been growing in places. There are irises at Fort Steele that have been growing there since the 1800s. And they're still growing there. And they have no problem growing there. So heritage irises in general. But here we go, the Algerian iris, which flowered so wonderfully in January and they got mashed by the snow. But nevertheless, it flowered wonderfully in January until it got mashed by the snow. Iris inguicularis, December to March, loves summer drought. In fact, requires summer drought. Once you've got it growing, it's fantastic. You know, it's, excuse me, calling Ontario. How cold is it there? What do you have? How much snow on the ground? Oh, minus 25? Oh, I'm sorry. I have a beautiful blue iris in my garden that I'm looking at here. We do this not frequently, but often enough just to take a deep breath and say, we do live in a wonderful place. Thank you. Dwarf bulbous irises. There they are. You can see them. I've planted them in pots and in pans. Many different kinds, and there are more that are being developed now. I don't know how strong they are, but we'll see, by a guy in Toronto called Alan McMurtry, who spoke to our group recently. They come from mountain slopes of Western Asia. The winters are wet, but the summers are dry, bone hot, dry. You can see their zones, probably 4 to 9. They take excellent drainage, super for raised beds. They will stay growing in a raised bed perennially, so they can naturalize, but not all of them. They're fantastic for pots. Excuse me, aren't those nice pots over there that you see? I think so. Thank you. A little bit of bone meal, weak fertilizer, and then you just leave them, and every 2 or 3 years you can divide them. I'll just show you a few to look at. This is the variety Regal, bred by Alan McMurtry. Beautiful. Here it's densely planted in a pot to look nice. When did they flower? Now. Just after the Algerian. So we started in January. We got flowers in February and March. So now we're into 3 months of bloom. Oh, sorry. Anyway, there was a beautiful one before there that you saw. But here's another one called North Star. So we're getting more yellows and whites combined. This is Eye Catcher, which is in one of the pots over there, which is a very attractive, small scale. But in the winter you garden on a small scale, like in a pot or a little rock garden. And you can use them for mass bedding in places and mix with other plants. This is Catherine Hodgkin. Here, it's actually declined a bit. I think you have to get new bulbs every once in a while, but divides easily for at least 5 or 10 years. And there we have a snowdrop. So you can mass bed your February irises if that's what you would like to do. Now bearded irises. So they come from not too big to very big. And I will talk about them from not too big to very big. First of all, they're drought tolerant. So fine. Excellent for our climate change gardens. Choosing your irises, so I would strongly advise you to go into the Historical Iris Preservation Society. We as a society are members of their society, and you've got huge amounts of information, a wonderful slideshow, and people are breeding them from very tiny ones. Here's Paul Black. Ted was talking about Mid-America Gardens as a place to order. Paul Black is the principal of Mid-America Gardens, and there's this huge. So he's worked in anything from tiny to really big up in here. These are all heritage ones, but they're gorgeous. And the range gives you an idea of the range. So let's start with dwarf bearded iris, Iris pumila. Pumila means small, from the Mediterranean area, from France and Greece and Italy. They don't grow very tall. But pumila is an incredibly drought-tolerant plant. It loves sun, it loves drought, so it's perfect for our future gardens. In rock gardens or at the edges of terraces where it gets lots of sun and it doesn't care about water whatsoever. And this is Coconino, very strong growing, reproduces very rapidly, and we've got it flowering in March. So now we've got irises from, in my garden, December, January, February, March, April. We haven't even got into the big showy prima donnas yet. And here it is, Coconino, drought tolerant. I just throw this in, stolen from greekflora.gr. This is Iris attica or Pumila attica, the dwarf iris growing in its typical habitat, which is almost no soil and a bunch of rocks. And it's Greece, so you know it's not cold. So what better choice for your garden than Iris pumila or dwarf bearded irises? There's another fantastic one from Ted, my share dwarf bearded iris. I mean, the colors are spectacular too, so you're not just stuck with yellow and purple, which is wonderful, but you have all these other choices now of colors, and they're all strong growers. Now we move into the middle size. Now, why are middle size irises about this high, not this high, so useful? Because they don't blow down in the wind. When the wind blows here, if you get a little storm passing by in May, down go the big ones. But the intermediate ones, which have flowers, are not quite as big, but often very many of them are just showing and standing up and doing a wonderful job, and they have drought tolerance. So this is a wonderful color combination, Flying Circus, another one by Ted Baker. Here's one that I grew, and one of you won this one. This is called Dragon Master, another intermediate bearded one. Does not blow down, increases rapidly, and flowers superbly. I grow it in a pot or on the ground. And Maui Moonlight. This is an indestructible, incredibly rapidly increasing iris. If you want an intermediate bearded iris, this is the best, probably. Now, Ted would have a different opinion than I do, but I bought this, I grow it, and it just increases, and I give it away, and it increases some more. Yes, Ted is nodding. He says, it's an excellent iris. You don't have to water it. Oh, and by the way, this one gets partial shade. So it doesn't get watered, it gets partial shade, so you can grow it in all sorts of sites on your property. Excellent choice. Oops. I just wanted to show this great picture from Ted's garden, which he doesn't have anymore. These are his intermediate irises here. A wonderful show. And you don't have to get them another foot taller and get knocked over by the wind. They stand up to the wind, and here's your color range of beautiful irises. And this is black currant or something, isn't it, Ted? Yeah. And Highland Nugget, and in the back I'm not sure which one that is. All great irises. Now, the tall ones, the divas of the iris, bearded iris world. This is what we all kind of think of as a bearded iris, but actually probably many of the ones that we remember from our childhood were not tall bearded irises. They were usually lower with smaller flowers. The problem with tall bearded irises is their flowers are so big that if there is any kind of a wind, they just flop right over and break off at the base of the stem, which is great for a cut flower to take home, but you lose the iris in the field. According to Ted and everything else I've read, Dusky Challenger doesn't flop over. It stands up straight. A lot of them are on an angle like this, and as soon as they're tipping over on an angle, they get great big heavy heads, like having too much to drink, they fall over because of the wind. Yes, Ted?
May I say, Dusky Challenger has won the popularity poll with the American Iris Society for over 30 years now. And so it's an historic iris now, but it is incredible.
So there we go. That is one that we should all have in our gardens. I actually don't have it. We need to be growing Dusky Challenger and giving it away to members of the Horticulture Center of the Pacific, so they actually have a garden iris that'll grow and guaranteed, and they'll want to grow more. Then they'll join our society. Yes. Dusky Challenger. Strong vertical stems, not tipping over, flowers not too big that flop over onto the ground. Here's a strong orange one, my favorite. Good show is a tall bearded iris, very rarely knocked over because it isn't quite as tall as tall. It does have big flowers, but slightly lower profile, stands up to the weather really well, not watered ever. Here we go, Knock 'em Dead, a tall bearded, if you like these new color combinations. Oh, flowers a little bit bigger, tends to be a little bit knocked over, but never watered. And guaranteed from year to year to year. Strong, modern, bicolor, no watering required. And then there's these group of irises being bred by a man in Central Europe, Anton Mego, and totally independent of whatever's going on in North America. And he comes up with some spectacular ones. The best one is really this one called Slovak Prince. It's a tall bearded iris, but it doesn't really, if you just abuse it a bit, it doesn't grow too tall and it doesn't blow over, and it has lots of flowers, and it's got this wonderful combination of purple, and then you can barely see the yellow at the edges of the standards. A very strong iris that increases rapidly. It's an excellent iris, again, never watered. No, a prima donna that's just beautiful. I mean, they are breeding these irises with huge frilly flowers with massive size. As soon as the wind blows, it falls over. Until the wind blows, it's spectacular. You just go and you go, oh my goodness, this is Daughter of Stars, another well-known iris. My goodness, what a show. And then the windstorm comes through and it's on the ground. It and a bunch of the other really tall ones. And the reason is that the flowers are just enormous. This is the flowers like this. But still, and then they breed them for more flowers, because that's, if you don't have 7, you're out of the picture. You're going to have 9 buds now. Well, if you have 4 or 5 of these big buds flowering at the same time, and the wind comes blowing by, crash, it's over. So pick it up, good cut flower. But still no watering. And then there are the rebloomers, and Penny talked about rebloomers. There's a whole bunch of them. If you treat them well, if you do in fact water them and feed them a little bit, they will flower again in August and September for you. And as late as October? Yes? Yeah. As late as October. So there you go. Double the show for one. And the older rebloomers, like Immortality, which is not very tall, the flowers are not of the strongest substance, but in the summer it doesn't matter because it's not very wet, or in the late summer, they're wonderful. And this one is guaranteed to rebloom, doesn't get blown over by the wind, and a very rapidly increasing iris. Of course, no water. Siberian irises, related to Sibirica and another species, medium-tall clump formers, matted rhizomes, medium to moist sites, but withstand summer drought. You give them humus and mulch, and they're going to love it because there'll be adequate, even moisture. Incredibly hardy, as you saw, as hardy as zone 1. You know, after that, it's the tundra. Pest and disease resistance. I've never had any pests on mine. Ted, have you ever had pests on yours? Never. You never have to spray, never have to do anything. Forever you have it. Yes, Ted.
Some aphids.
Oh, some aphids. Well, they're so small you'd never see them. I don't exactly. They're wind resistant because they've got flexible wandy stems rather than stiff fall over stems. And their uses are huge. You can naturalize them, just plant them along streams or in grassy areas, focus beds, swales where you collect the rainwater, landscape scale because you can divide them and plant huge numbers of them, and in a perennial border. So join the society, get the bulletin, and you'll read up about what's going on with Siberians. Tremendous breeding breakthroughs. We're beyond a little bit of yellow, purple, and white ones, which are wonderful and incredibly tough. Now we're getting unbelievable colors that are just hard to imagine. So there's the show bed from the 2012 convention that we had here. This is at Royal Road, so you can get a sense of how big the flowers are and the nature of them. Here's Devil's Dream, a Siberian iris. It's kind of a traditional color, the purple-blue kind.
Richard,
Yep.
it will bloom into July.
This one so.
It continues to bloom until
Right, so that's why it's popular, because it's a long blooming season. So now we've gone from December and we're into July. So no irises, we've got still irises in the garden. A wonderful plant called Lucy Locket, a yellow Siberian, huge numbers of flowers and not too tall, just massive color. Does extremely well in my garden. I don't water it in the summer. And then the new guys, they're not that new anymore, but newish, Carnivaletto. And we're getting color coming out of the throat onto the lips, onto the falls over here. Beautiful combinations in the standards and the stigmatic surfaces. And paprikash, which is a totally wonderful new color being added to the collection of colors we've had. And there are many, many more. This is nothing. Again, go to the bulletin and you can see what they're doing with them now. So Siberians, grow them in a swale, but if you get them well established, they can take drought as well. So another beautiful choice for our climate change gardens. And the ones we never think about much. Why? Well, there's some over here, but off the camera. On the camera. These are beautiful Dutch bulbous irises related to, or parents of this are Iris xiphium from Spain, I think. And these are the ones you buy in the store, and they cut them and you just grow them whatever way you can grow them in your garden into very large clumps of bulbs. You can divide them up and spread them around. And they are also pretty drought tolerant. Now, I don't know if they take really dry conditions, but here you see the zones, 5 to 9 probably, the Floris iris, and they have a whole selection of color possibilities, which I'm showing you some here. This just came from a mixture, no name, nothing. That was one of the things in the mixture. This was another one in the mixture. So now there are blues and yellows and whites and bronzes and in-betweenses. Now, I'm getting near the end to talk about some of these groups that are not as well known, which we should know better, because we have some really special people here, like Joyce Prothero here, banner for Iona, that's from her, using West Coast California species mainly, that are very well suited to our conditions. They will take a dry summer to some extent, but my experience is they need a bit of moisture to get them going well established. Joyce, they won't go in hot, dry sites, will they, or will they? They won't grow in hot, dry sites? No. But they will take shade. A little bit of shade, yeah. Because they're, pardon me?
They don't need water in the summer. I never water mine.
Okay, they don't need water in the summer. There you go. So these are just being developed now from native West Coast North American species. And there are tremendous colors and opportunities coming from them. We're just learning about how wonderful these could be for our gardens. And we have one of the experts in our society. Then there are these Spuria irises. Now usually the ones I know, they're very tall, like this, and they're kind of yellow or pale yellow, buttery flowers. But they're being bred as well into a variety of colors and forms. Winter wet, summer dry, hot. They need no summer water whatsoever. In fact, they prefer no summer water. Their native habitat is damp meadows, salty soils. Salty tells you something about their habitat requirements, which means they don't need a lot of water. They tolerate low amount of water because salty soils don't yield water for the plants. Hard to get the water out of a salty soil. So these would be kinds of plants that could grow in the Okanagan, which they're hardy enough, zones 4 to 9. And I don't think mine don't blow over. The Spurias, they don't. And they're very tall, like way more tough than the tall bearded irises, if you want to show you irises. And these are summer irises. So July. So we're December to July. August is reblooming time, so now already we're in October. So we've had irises in our gardens blooming on the coast from December to October. Not much left. They need to go to sleep for a little bit. And arrowbreds. This is a group of irises that involves hybridizing tall bearded irises with a bunch of heat and kind of pretty fussy irises from hot, dry climates. But the arrowbreds themselves are not so fussy. They can tolerate pretty extreme conditions. The lower end of them, I'm not sure of. I just looked at the distribution. I saw some information. 3, maybe even colder than 3. So very widely adapted, very showy, very tall, excellent cut flowers, and we're getting new hybrids developing all the time. So if you want some height, you plant some Spurias. Japanese, we're now into the wet ones. Acid wet to moist soils. They blow over in the wind because they have big plate-like flowers. But they're very good for, if you have a rain garden, wet swales or pond side. So if you have a damp site, these are very good irises for it. And they don't need to be submerged in water. They actually prefer to be just at the water table or slightly higher. You can mulch them. The roots can get at the water, but in particular, their crowns don't freeze, which is an important thing for them. This is indigo angel. They don't freeze in the water in the ice layer. And so you see, they're hardy too, 4 to 9. So indigo angel, Aitken Simon Creek Farm. There's lots of them. You can often buy 1 or 2 of these just at Buckerfields or anywhere else where you get irises that are just sold as Japanese irises. They usually don't even have a name. They just said Japanese iris. And I've got one growing in mine in a relatively dry site. So winter wet, but summer somewhat dry. So as we wind up, here is the recommendation from the Historical Iris Preservation Society. Now they're talking mainly about bearded irises. Most important, when in doubt, err on the dry side. In other words, irises are great subjects for gardens of the future with summer moisture challenges. Forget trying to grow rhododendrons and south-facing without pouring a pile of water on them. I can't do it. I don't even bother anymore. On the north side, yes. On the south side, no. When in doubt, err on the dry side. Irises are your choice. A couple of final points. So, you can never know. This is a picture that you provided me, Penny. Penny's friend, Lachelle Lalonde, who has those of you who are at the annual general meeting here know that we're going to go to the Okanagan. There was a fire started by the neighbor, and this is the Okanagan, you know, like fires, because fires can spread. It went over top of the irises, burnt off the old ones, and essentially got put down by the irises, because you can't burn irises. Right? Once you burn the few dead leaves, there's no fuel, there's no sticks, there's nothing. So they could be a fire break, and according to Penny, they flowered even better after the fire. So they're fire resistant and fire responding. So not only do they tolerate drought, but they tolerate and actually like fire and protect your house. Now, what more can you possibly ask for than a fireman iris? Yes?
I think the deer don't like them either.
And the deer don't like them mostly. We can get into that as another argument, but yes, you're right. The deer largely will not eat them. And if they do, they'll eat off the dry, dead bits and nothing will burn, and you've got a wonderful fire break. Now, I'm going to just give you one more picture. So, a couple of years ago, we were in the south of France, and we went, my clever son said, we should go to this winery here. By the way, it's a fantastic winery to go and drink under the giant plane trees and a 17th century old chateau surrounded by vineyards and olive trees and whatever. And the wine's great and incredibly cheap. And they feed you while you're at it for 16 euro. You walk toward the building, and in front of them is this massive, and this was in the fall, so it was all dead iris leaves, but nothing but irises, pretty much. How long was it? Like 100 feet long? The length of the chateau, right? So this is one of their landscape beds. Irises is landscape plants. We're looking, so I only saw the leaves. I emailed them. I said, could you send me a picture of what they look like when they're in bloom? Ta-da! And there's the vineyard in the distance. And then behind, which doesn't show up, is a 300 to 400-year-old chateau with great wine. So there you go. Irises in a dry, warm Mediterranean climate as a landscape plant. I have one piece of this that I've got growing in my garden. I don't know what it is, but I sure would love to use it and get, and we could have giant beds and nothing else. They can't weed this on any scale that I can imagine that would be effective. They just have crowded out everything else. And now you have this. So not only as a special garden plant, but as a landscape plant in a dry, hot, new world that's coming to us soon. Oops. Thank you very much for coming. Please join the Society if you haven't. Thank you to the Society, to Ted, who provided pictures, the Historical Iris Preservation Society, Growers Past and Present, the Horticulture Center of the Pacific for having us here, Freya Kenny, who's provided the pictures of the rain gardens, Aitken Salmon Creek Farm, and my dear son here who helped me out and is also videotaping us. And this is one of Ted's favorites, Celtic Woman, which is a tall bearded iris, grows in my garden. And what do I say when I talk about irises? Never watered once it's established. So there you go, plant irises in your climate change garden. Thank you very much.